Beneath the shadows of history lies a harrowing truth. The untold abuse of slaves, hidden from the pages of textbooks, will shatter your heart. Their silent screams and unheard cries echo through time, revealing a brutality that will make you weep. These forgotten stories demand to be heard, compelling us to confront a past marred by unimaginable suffering and cruelty. Stay tuned as we journey into the most engrossing story ever told on slavery. Let's get right into details. The intimate exploitation of enslaved people in Virginia was a pervasive and brutal aspect of enslavement, affecting both women and men in numerous ways. Enslavers committed assault and abuse, coerced reproduction to increase their own wealth, and used the bodies of the enslaved for profit, pleasure, and punishment. The objectification of black bodies in Western culture amplified the vulnerability of enslaved individuals. This exploitation not only harmed their well-being, but also strained the marriages and relationships they held dear. Historical records reveal the widespread nature of mixed-race intimate relationships during slavery, with Virginia leading the southern states with approximately 44,000 mixed-race enslaved individuals by 1850. While some of these relationships were long-term, and some enslaved people engaged in intimate relations with their enslavers or other white individuals to survive and secure better treatment, historians question the possibility of true consent within such starkly unequal power dynamics, unveiling the hidden horrors, abuse, and the brutal reality of enslaved plantations. Abuse was a constant terror in Virginia's slavery history, mirroring a broader pattern across the American South. Enslavers wielded total control over enslaved bodies, exploiting opportunities to impose their will in brutal ways. Plantation culture, built on a rigid white male hierarchy, emboldened enslavers to degrade and dominate the enslaved. Laws offered no refuge, failing to recognize the abuse of enslaved women as a crime. The 1859 Mississippi Supreme Court case, George v. State, exemplified this horror, ruling that a black enslaved man couldn't be convicted of abusing an enslaved woman, as the law only protected white women. This dehumanization rendered enslaved sufferings invisible, their cries for justice unheard. Enslaved bodies became battlegrounds of power and violence, with tormentors facing no legal consequences. This grim reality underscores the profound injustice and suffering endured by the enslaved. Due to the absence of legal protection, historians lack a comprehensive archive of legal cases to determine the full extent of abuse against the enslaved. Instead, they must rely on alternative forms of evidence. For enslaved women, in particular, slave narratives reveal the pervasive and constant threat of abuse perpetrated by enslavers, their family members, overseers, and others. Harriet Jacobs vividly described this brutal reality in her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. 1861. My master was, to my knowledge, the father of 11 slaves. But did the mothers dare to tell who was the father of their children? Did the other slaves dare to allude to it, except in whispers among themselves? No, indeed. They knew too well the terrible consequences. Elizabeth Keckley, born into slavery in Virginia and later taken to North Carolina, recounted her harrowing experiences in her memoir, Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. 1868. She revealed enduring, repeated abuse by the son of a wealthy neighboring plantation owner, acts that were a brutal assertion of power. These assaults resulted in the birth of her son, fathered by her assailant. Keckley's story exemplifies the pervasive abuse enslaved women endured, seen by their assailants as property, not people. Her memoir not only illuminates personal suffering, but also testifies to the widespread abuse inflicted upon enslaved individuals. Despite trauma, Keckley's courage in sharing her story provides insight into slavery's harsh realities and highlights the resilience of those who endured such brutality. Reverend Israel Massey, born into slavery in Emporia, recounted similar horrors, noting that enslavers and overseers would often send husbands out on the farm, milking cows or cutting wood. Then he gets in bed with the slave himself. Some women would fight and tussle. Others would be humble, feared of that beating. These first-hand accounts paint a harrowing picture of the lived experiences of enslaved women, who endured not only the physical and psychological torment of abuse, but also the suffocating silence imposed by the ever-present threat of brutal punishment. In a shocking display of depravity, two students at the University of Virginia in 1826 perpetrated a heinous act of abuse against a 16-year-old enslaved woman, callously exploiting her vulnerable position. The brutal assault was compounded by a vicious and humiliating attack, stripping her of her dignity and physical well-being, as punishment for allegedly transmitting a venereal disease to her assailants. This appalling incident, as chronicled by Alan Taylor in Thomas Jefferson's Education, 2019, serves as a stark reminder of the entrenched culture of exploitation and violence that perpetuated the enslavement era, perpetuating a cycle of abuse that would haunt generations to come. The scourge of abuse was not limited to enslaved women, as men were also subjected to this heinous violation. Enslavers asserted their dominance by exploiting male slaves, perpetuating a culture of abuse and humiliation. A harrowing incident in Maryland in 1787 illustrates this brutality, where an enslaved man was coerced at gunpoint by two white men to commit a heinous act against a free black woman. Resistance was often met with brutal force, resulting in whipping, sale to a plantation in the Lower South, and separation from loved ones. Despite the dire consequences, some enslaved individuals courageously resisted their oppressors, fighting back or self-emancipating. In extreme cases, they resorted to killing their abusers, a desperate act born of unimaginable suffering. The resilience and bravery of these individuals serve as a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure and resist, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The acknowledgement of abuse against enslaved men and women is crucial in understanding the comprehensive horrors of slavery and the unyielding struggle for freedom and human dignity that defined the enslaved experience. Western culture's objectification of black bodies significantly contributed to the vulnerability and exploitation of enslaved men and women. Early European travelers depicted black women as especially fertile, a stereotype that was carried over to justify non-consensual, intimate contact with enslaved women. This harmful perception allowed enslavers to rationalize their abuses, seeing black women not as individuals, but as mere property. Both enslaved men and women endured severe violations of their bodies and were denied any semblance of privacy. Enslavers frequently scrutinized, groped, and objectified them, treating their bodies as commodities rather than human beings. At slave auctions, black women were often paraded with their bodies exposed to advertise their potential to bear children, a dehumanizing practice that highlighted their reproductive capabilities to prospective buyers. Stripping enslaved individuals to whip them was another common form of humiliation, adding a layer of psychological trauma to the physical punishment. The inadequate clothing provided to enslaved people further contributed to their vulnerability. This lack of proper attire exposed them to the elements and underscored their perceived inferiority and object status in the eyes of their enslavers. Such exposure was not just a matter of physical discomfort, but a constant reminder of their subjugated status. François-Jean de Chastellux, traveling in 18th century to Virginia, noted seeing young Negroes from 16 to 20 years old, with not an article of clothing, but a loose shirt descending halfway down their thighs, waiting at table, illustrating the degree of exposure and indignity faced by enslaved individuals. These practices were integral to the system of slavery, which relied on the dehumanization and objectification of black bodies to maintain control and justify exploitation. The objectification of enslaved people were tools of oppression, reinforcing the power dynamics that allowed enslavers to dominate every aspect of their lives. Forced breeding and reproductive exploitation, the coercive control of enslaved bodies. Enslavers in the antebellum South had a profound financial stake in the reproduction of enslaved people, particularly because the children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's enslaved status. This concept, termed natural increase, became a crucial economic factor that enriched enslavers' profits. Nowhere was this more evident than in Virginia and other Upper South states, where a combination of factors, including a large enslaved population, the cessation of the transatlantic slave trade, and a declining agricultural economy incentivized enslavers to capitalize on the sale of surplus enslaved labor to the burgeoning cotton states of the Lower South. In 1832, during a contentious debate over slavery in the Virginia House of Delegates, James H. Golson of Brunswick County articulated the enslaver's perspective on reproduction. He likened the enslaver's right to the increase of their enslaved women to that of the owner of brood mares, highlighting the dehumanizing comparison of enslaved women to livestock solely valued for their reproductive capabilities. Golson emphasized that this increase constituted a significant portion of their wealth, underscoring how deeply intertwined economic interests were with the perpetuation of slavery. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, another participant in the same debate, provided alarming statistics to support the economic importance of the slave trade within Virginia. He noted that approximately 8,500 enslaved people were annually exported from Virginia to the Deep South. This practice of rearing slaves for market, as Randolph described it, reflected the brutal reality that enslavers treated human beings as commodities to be bred, sold, and traded for profit. Enslaved individuals, particularly women, endured the additional burden of being valued not for their inherent worth or humanity, but for their ability to produce more enslaved laborers. The economic imperative to maximize natural increase led to systematic exploitation and control over enslaved women's reproductive capacities. Enslavers often coerced enslaved women into bearing children at a young age, and without regard for their health or well-being. This exploitation was justified by the economic logic that more children meant more potential laborers to cultivate crops like cotton, which fueled the Southern economy's expansion. The commodification of enslaved people's reproductive capacities extended beyond economic exploitation. It also perpetuated cycles of trauma and separation within enslaved families. Children were often forcibly separated from their mothers and sold to different enslavers, contributing to the pervasive cruelty and inhumanity of slavery. Overall, the financial incentives embedded in the system of slavery reinforced and perpetuated its brutal practices. The exploitation of enslaved women's reproductive abilities underscored the deep-seated dehumanization at the core of slavery, where individuals were reduced to mere property and economic assets. The debates and practices surrounding natural increase in Virginia vividly illustrate how economic interests drove the perpetuation and expansion of slavery in America's antebellum South. Historians, while not universally in agreement, acknowledge from compelling oral histories and first-hand testimonies that enslavers frequently engaged in the systemic coercion of enslaved individuals for reproductive purposes. These accounts vividly portray the grim reality faced by enslaved people under the control of ruthless masters. James Green, a former slave in Virginia, recounted how his master wielded absolute authority over marital arrangements on the plantation. "He chooses to wife for every man on de place," Green recalled. "No one had no say as to who he was going to get for a wife. All the wedding ceremony we had was with Moster's finger pointing out who was whose wife." This stark portrayal underscores the complete lack of autonomy and personal agency suffered by enslaved individuals, reducing their most intimate relationships to the whims of their enslavers. Will Ann Rogers, drawing from her mother's experiences as a Virginia slave, recalled a chillingly utilitarian approach to reproduction among enslaved people. According to Rogers, her mother described how owners mated slaves like stock, emphasizing the dehumanizing manner in which enslavers treated human beings as mere breeding units for economic gain. Sam Everett, another Virginia slave, provided a harrowing glimpse into the sadistic practices of his master, known ominously as Big Jim. Everett remembered instances where Big Jim forced reluctant slaves to consummate relationships in his presence. If there seemed to be any slight reluctance on the part of either of the unfortunate ones, Everett recounted, Big Jim would make them consummate this relationship in his presence. This coercion not only stripped enslaved individuals of their dignity, but also served as a tool of control and dominance, where physical and psychological violence were used to enforce compliance. Beyond mere economic exploitation, these practices provided sadistic pleasure for enslavers like Big Jim. Quite often, he and his guests would engage in these debaucheries, choosing for themselves the prettiest of the young women. This horrifying revelation illustrates how the debasement of enslaved bodies extended beyond profit motives to encompass the depraved desires and moral corruption of those in power. These accounts challenge any romanticized notions of slavery, revealing instead a brutal system where human lives and bodies were systematically exploited and dehumanized. The control over reproduction was not only an economic strategy, but a means of asserting dominance and perpetuating a cycle of trauma and suffering among enslaved communities. Such narratives underscore the urgent need to confront the legacy of slavery honestly and recognize the enduring impact of its atrocities on American society. Enslaved women endured a dehumanizing existence where their worth was often reduced to their reproductive capabilities. Accounts from the era paint a stark picture of how enslavers commodified and controlled their bodies, with callous disregard for their humanity. One vivid recollection by Massey, who witnessed local slave auctions, reveals the appalling language used to describe enslaved women. They were labeled as fine wenches, or good breeders, emphasizing their utility solely for producing offspring. This terminology not only objectified these women, but also underscored how their value was determined by their ability to bear children for their owners. Similarly, some enslaved men, particularly those with imposing physical stature, were designated as stockmen. Their role was not to form families, but to impregnate multiple women indiscriminately, regardless of existing family ties. One chilling account tells of a slave who was coerced into fathering children with 15 women, highlighting the brutal disregard for personal autonomy and familial bonds under slavery. Even when some enslavers allowed enslaved individuals to choose their partners, coercion remained pervasive. Young enslaved girls approaching adulthood faced pressure to select a mate quickly, lest their owner make the choice for them. The consequences of failing to reproduce were severe. Women who did not bear children faced devaluation and the constant threat of being sold away from their families, further fracturing already fragile familial bonds. Enslavers employed various methods to encourage childbirth among enslaved women, ranging from subtle incentives to overt coercion. Pregnant and nursing women were often given extra rations and lighter workloads, not out of compassion, but to maximize their productivity for the owner's benefit. Some enslavers even offered small gifts or promises of emancipation in exchange for bearing children. For instance, in 1792, Virginia enslaver B. Talbert promised Jenny, an enslaved woman, freedom for herself and her 6th child if she bore him 5 children. This transaction, documented by historian Deborah Gray White, exemplifies the exploitation and manipulation embedded in the institution of slavery. These narratives underscore the systemic exploitation and dehumanization endured by enslaved women, where their bodies were ruthlessly controlled and their reproductive capacities were exploited for profit and convenience. The legacy of such practices continues to resonate, highlighting the enduring impact of slavery on African American communities and the ongoing struggle for justice and recognition of historical injustices. A relationship built on oppression. Silas Omohundro's enslaved concubine. Historian Brenda Stevenson observed that relationships between enslavers and enslaved people ranged from abuse and exploitation to instances that might superficially resemble romance or even marriage. Deborah Gray White argued that while not all relationships were initially exploitative, most ultimately were under the context of slavery. Many enslaved women, faced with few options, acquiesced to their enslavers' advances to improve their treatment or secure better conditions for themselves and their children. Some, like Harriet Jacobs, entered relationships with other white men to avoid abuse from their primary enslavers. Enslavers sometimes promised freedom to favored concubines and their offspring, though such pledges often went unfulfilled due to the owner's death or economic instability on plantations. In the antebellum South, a clandestine world of intimate relationships between enslavers and enslaved women flourished, hidden in plain sight. Mary Boykin Chestnut's diary revelations exposed the prevalence of such arrangements, where mulattoes abounded, their paternity openly acknowledged by all but their own mothers. Brenda Stevenson's analysis of the 1850 U.S. Census reveals a staggering 44,299 mixed-race enslaved individuals in Virginia alone, comprising over 10% of the enslaved population. This shocking truth shatters the facade of propriety, revealing a society built on exploitation, deception, and the commodification of human bodies. The whispers of the past scream loudly, demanding acknowledgement of this dark legacy. Light-skinned enslaved women, products of mixed-race relationships, were highly vulnerable to exploitation. They were often sold as concubines, fetching high prices. Enslaved men, particularly light-skinned ones, were also targeted. White women engaged in intimate relations with enslaved men, with some instances of white women initiating relationships. Divorce petitions in antebellum Virginia reveal cases of interracial adultery, with white men complaining about their wives' relationships with black men. Travelers and neighbors documented instances of white women pursuing relationships with enslaved men without expressing shock or surprise. The untold abuses of slaves are a painful reminder of humanity's darkest moments. The tears, screams, and silent sufferings of the enslaved echo through history, a haunting testament to the brutality of oppression. As we confront these horrors, our hearts ache with sorrow, and our minds struggle to comprehend the cruelty. Yet, in acknowledging the unimaginable suffering of the enslaved, we honor their memories and perpetuate their legacies. May their stories inspire us to fight for a future where all humanity is treated with dignity and respect, and may their tears never be forgotten. Your thoughts on this complex topic are invaluable. Feel free to share your insights in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest uploads. Thanks for watching.